Hey everyone, it's Virtual Boy WAAAAH! Episode 8. Virtual Boy Wario Land is generally regarded as the high point of the Virtual Boy's existence, the flat-out best game on the system. It's hard to argue with that position, though it does feel a little tragic to think that the best Virtual Boy had to offer was a game that arguably could have been done on any other system at the time. VB Wario Land arrived on the heels of Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3 for Game Boy, and it shows. It has much more in common with the original Wario Land than with the madly inventive Wario Land 2, from its treasure hunting premise to its power mechanics. When stripped from the stereoscopic viewpoint of the Virtual Boy and presented in a classic Game Boy monochrome, its roots shine through. This really does feel like a juiced-up Game Boy adventure. And while there's a bit of messing around with 3D parallax effects to be found, by and large, VB Wario Land is a bread-and-butter kind of action platformer, light on gimmickry and high on exploration and environmental puzzle solving. I regret to report that it's also arguably the weakest entry in the entire Wario Land franchise, outside of the gorgeous but otherwise rote Wario Land Shake It. It's a damn fine game, but it does feel a little underbaked, which is probably unavoidable due to the tragic circumstances surrounding its creation. The Virtual Boy's entire software release window was only about half a year long, and in that time Nintendo R&D1-developed or co-developed 5 games for the system: Mario's Tennis, TELEROBOXER, GALACTIC Pinball, Mario Clash, and Wario Land. It's a lot of responsibility for a single division of the company to handle, while also overseeing development of the system itself. And even though Wario Land arrived in the back half of Virtual Boy's abbreviated life, you definitely get the impression it was whisked through development to strike while the iron was anything approaching hot. VB Wario Land consists of a mere 10 stages and it's remarkably light on challenge. R&D1 would abandon the idea of traditional difficulty indicators for Wario Land with Wario Land 2, rendering the character essentially invincible. But here he still makes use of a Mario-style power-up system, complete with shrinking into a horrible little mohawked goblin version of himself when he takes damage. I personally ended up with nearly 50 lives in reserve when I reached the final boss on my very first playthrough of the game. VB Wario Land carries forward the fundamental design precepts of its predecessor, playing as a slow and methodical application of the Mario formula that sees platforming less as a test of athletic skill and more as a vehicle for comprehensively scouring the environment for hidden goodies. The Mario games have occasionally dabbled in this concept, most notably with Super Mario World, but Wario Land takes it much further than Mario ever could. The hero, or anti-hero's physical bulk and personality lend themselves to a slower, more methodical form of gameplay than Mario's relatively lithe, physique and his perky personality. Plus, Wario is all about greed and acquisition. Mario acquires coins as a matter of course to buy extra lives, but Wario Land notably changes its mechanics so that coins are entirely separate from play chances. To earn 1-ups, Wario collects hearts. Coins instead function strictly as loot that determine the final outcome of the adventure, kind of like in DuckTales. There's a little bit of bleed over in that massive gemstones net Wario a 1-up, but otherwise the division between collectibles reinforces the fact that this guy is super greedy. As a matter of fact, this is an adventure that transpires entirely due to Wario's greed. Where other characters in the Nintendo pantheon tend to play more of a reactive role, venturing forth to rescue abducted princesses or counter a sinister plot by space pirates, Wario has no motivation to leap into action here besides his sheer, unrepentant cupidity. The adventure begins with Wario deep in a wine-induced nap beside a pond in a secluded grotto. A random beaver wakes him from his slumber just in time to spot a line of weird critters toting treasures to a vault in the distance. Spurred into covetous action, Wario follows them to their hideout and activates a trap as he attempts to break into the safe. He plunges far underground, and the 10 treasures surrounding the vault vanish into parts unknown. You can think of VB Wario Land almost as a sort of opposite to Jack Brothers. Rather than working your way down into the netherworld, you're working your way up to the surface from the bottom of a vault. And rather than racing against time, you're prowling all 10 stages in an attempt to collect cash, seek out the 10 missing treasures, and find the key to unlock the elevator leading to the next stage. There is a timer here, but it's 20 minutes per level, a generous allocation that only feels restrictive in the final levels. If you die, the timer resets, as do the locations of all the hearts, power-ups, and coins you've acquired, though keys and treasures do remain in your inventory. Between each stage, you can play various mini-games to earn extra hearts or cash before tallying up your earnings and advancing to the next level. You can also use the elevator system to descend back down to previous stages, which is handy if you miss one of the hidden treasures. a likely prospect since VB Wario Land stages are fairly large and non-linear in nature, making it easy to overlook an obscure corner. Most treasures, and indeed most other objects, are hidden behind doors that can only be revealed by smashing ceilings, walls, blocks, and even flooring. Wario commands an unusual power-up scheme that allows him to work toward a single ultimate form through multiple routes. As in the original Game Boy Wario Land, Wario's powers are denoted by the hat he currently wears. By default, Wario dons a pith helmet, and the power-ups you encounter along the way allow you to swap out his headgear for a new skill set. The bullhorns allow Wario to charge enemies, which can also cause breakable walls and blocks to shatter upon impact. In Bull Wario form, he can also use Mario's butt stomp skill to smash the floor, with the side effect of stunning and dislodging foes. The dragon and eagle hats make Wario less physically powerful than the bull, stripping his ability to crush the ground with a butt stomp. However, the dragon hat allows you to breathe hot steam that reveals secrets and destroys enemies, while the eagle hat is focused on mobility and allows you to perform air dashes. Ultimately though, what you're after is the Royal Dragon upgrade. It combines the features of all three hats: butt stomping, projectile flinging, and air dashing. His maxed out skills are definite requirements for hunting down all the treasures scattered throughout the underground. As in his other adventures, Wario doesn't take damage from simple contact with enemies. Instead, he can only be hurt by things that look dangerous: spikes, fires, explosions, that sort of thing. Enemies typically have some sort of sharp edge to them or spiked equipment that has to be avoided, but you can bump into mini-foes and knock them out upon contact as long as you dodge their pointy bits. Stun foes can be lifted and tossed, allowing you to move them out of the action, destroy other enemies, or feed them to special coin clouds that belch out crown tokens worth 20 standard coins for each monster they absorb. This gives VB Wario Land a fairly unique flow, something that would change considerably in its sequels. There's nowhere near as much of the environmental puzzle solving as you find in Wario Land 2 and 3, and you rarely encounter the kind of limited, one-shot opportunities found in Wario Land 4. So on the whole, it's more or less a straightforward action game that takes the hunt everywhere for stuff design of mid-80s platformers and makes the hidden objects and passages a lot more intuitive. The level design is pretty good about making the placement of secrets pretty easily grasped once you learn to read the developer's design cues. So while you do spend a lot of time smashing into seemingly inert walls and ceilings in search of clues, it's rarely a blind hunt. While VB Wario Land is fairly brief and decidedly light on challenge, it's hard to complain too much due to the game's sheer beauty. Virtual Boy's video output capabilities were essentially Game Boy on steroids, and that's never more apparent than it is here. This is, without question, the best looking 8-bit Wario game. Or, for that matter, it looks better than any 8-bit Mario game. R&D1's team put their all into the visual design of a game whose graphics were to be rendered in 4 shades of red, and every screen of this adventure just bursts with attention to detail. For one thing, even though VB Wario Land only encompasses 10 stages and 4 boss encounters, it's worth noting that every single one of those levels is completely different from the others. From underwater caverns to haunted mansions to blazing hot factories, every level here doesn't simply encompass a distinct visual style, but also a unique play mechanic. The forest stage, for example, involves a lot of vertical traversal and puts the eagle power up to great use. The factory involves a lot of vanishing platforms, while the greenhouse level, I guess, features timed puzzles that revolve around flinging watermelons. There's a great mix of action and brain teasing between the different stages, and you have to switch gears with every new area you reach. And unlike stages in the core Mario games, which typically last only a few minutes before sending you along to the next, VB Wario Land stages can take 10 or 15 minutes apiece to clear. VB Wario Land also incorporates Virtual Boy's parallax visuals into its design in a fairly unobtrusive way. Every stage has multiple layers, typically a foreground and background plane. Wario can travel across planes by leaping onto special platforms that send him flying into or out of the screen. The effect isn't all that different from, say, entering a door and ducking into another room in any other Wario game, but typically the scene doesn't switch as you move into the background. Wario instead becomes tiny in the distance and scrambles about like normal, running, jumping, and smashing into the scenery to uncover goodies. It's not only a clever use of the stereoscopic screen's ability to simulate dimensionality, but it also puts the Virtual Boy's impressive pixel resolution to use. Wario can work as a tiny, distant version of himself because his normal foreground version is huge. Wario's standard sprite is absolutely enormous, much larger than the protagonist sprite in any other pixel-based Wario or Mario game. And the world reflects his scale. The environments feel less crowded than in Game Boy's Wario Land titles thanks to the widescreen format and resolution of Virtual Boy, and when you go sailing into the background, there's enough detail and resolution to keep things playable. Many of the game's trickiest puzzles involve finding the platforms that let you shift between layers. And in later stages, additional layers come into play as you can duck into doors within the background plane. In keeping with the R&D1 tradition of carefully considered audio design, VB Wario Land's soundscape reflects Wario's current position relative to the player. When you leap into the background, the music and sound effects become somewhat muted. The idea being, I suppose, that the background tunes are in fact diegetic and anchored to Wario's perspective. As an even nicer touch, the music becomes quieter still anytime Wario ducks further into the background by way of a door. This is a heroic bit of work for a game its creators must have known was doomed to obscurity. Virtual Boy was a tragedy, and VB Wario Land may be the slightest entry in the series, but by God, every inch of the game is redolent with genuine creative passion. About the only part of VB Wario Land that feels somewhat lacking are the 4 boss stages. Each boss is prefaced by a little mini-guardian that has to be defeated before you can face the bad guy, which feels kind of like shades of Metroid Fusion and those weird eyeball doors. The bosses make heavy use of 3D visuals and layering, and they're okay. They move into and out of the foreground, which is fine, but these tend to force the player into a largely passive role. All but one of the bosses involves spending a lot of time dodging attacks until you finally have a momentary opening to attack. Considering that the entire premise of this game is that Wario is proactive to the point of recklessness, being forced to sit around waiting until he's allowed to strike at a bad guy feels like it misses the point of the whole thing. The final boss is the most annoying since he can only be struck by leaping between foreground and background layers, but only when he happens to be at a specific point in space, which he rarely moves to. It's a tedious and frustrating battle, made all the more annoying by the fact that you have to wade through his lengthy introductory animation every time you face him. But really, none of these complaints, mediocre bosses, low difficulty, underwhelming length, are deal breakers. VB Wario Land shows off the kind of love Nintendo puts into its games, even games about a second stringer for a dead-on-arrival platform. It also unintentionally hints at gaming's future. Console makers, especially Nintendo, love gimmicky hardware, and Virtual Boy's failure didn't deter anyone from putting together entire platforms in the future based around oddball features. As we've seen time and again over the past decade and a half with DS, Wii, 3DS, Wii U, and PlayStation Vita, software makers for these systems love to create games that attempt to take advantage of those new systems' weird gimmicks. But ultimately, it's the games that stick to core design strengths and make hardware-specific features a secondary consideration that fare best in the long run. VB Wario Land demonstrated this almost 25 years ago. Just think how many clumsy 5 out of 10 launch titles we could have been spared over the years if anyone had been paying attention. But then again, how many people ever even played VB Wario Land to learn from the object lessons it had to offer? The good news is that VB Wario Land's restrained use of Virtual Boy's parallax effects means it's a game that would transport over quite nicely to any other platform. And really, doesn't an adventure this carefully crafted deserve to reach a wider audience? Virtual Boy Wario Land needn't be tied to Virtual Boy forever. We can only hope that someday Nintendo decides to dust it off and bring it to a larger, more appreciative audience. Next on Virtual Boy Works, Wario Land may be the platform's pinnacle, but it's not all garbage from here on out, as Bomberman makes his sole VB appearance.